Hello everyone, and welcome to Sherlock Tales. Tonight, I invite you to sit back, relax, and let the rain, or perhaps the quiet ticking of a clock, soothe your thoughts. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Type it in the comments, because tonight's mystery, oddly enough, is all about time. Time lost, time stolen, and the man who tried to trap it. It was on the morning of October 17th, 1893, that Sherlock Holmes received the letter which would lead us into one of the most baffling cases of his career, a case that, despite all rational explanation, seemed to defy the very laws of time itself. The missive arrived with the first light of dawn, slipped quietly under the door of our flat at 221B Baker Street. Holmes, who had already been awake for some hours, he claimed he'd not slept at all, was seated cross-legged on the floor, studying a small pile of soot scraped from the inside of a violin. He glanced at the envelope, noted the handwriting, and tossed the contents toward me without a word. The paper was cream, thick, and stamped with an intricate crest, a pair of hands cupping a broken clock. Mr. Holmes, I beg of you, come to the village of Norbridge at once. Something impossible has occurred. A man is dead, a room sealed. Every timepiece in his home stopped at precisely 4:17. No signs of trauma, no broken glass, and yet the man is cold, lifeless, and I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, he was heard speaking well after his death. We are not superstitious people, but this cannot be ignored. I shall expect you by first train. Yours, in urgency, Constable Edgar Lyle. I looked up. Every clock stopped. Holmes stood, dusted off his knees, and gave a half smile. Now that, Watson, is intriguing. Shall we take a short holiday to the countryside? The village of Norbridge, nestled in a valley of Wiltshire some 3 hours west of London, was the kind of place the map barely remembered. We arrived at 10:30 under grey skies, the chill of early autumn curling around the station platform like a ghost. A small, thick-set man with a bristled moustache and a constable's badge awaited us. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm Lyle. Bless you both for coming. This is no ordinary business. Holmes, in his long coat and gloved hands, inclined his head. You wrote of a sealed room and clocks. Aye, Lyle said, already turning toward his cart. You'll see for yourselves. Old Josiah Penfield, the clockmaker, you've heard of him? Holmes nodded faintly. A man of some notoriety in horological circles, a recluse, inventive. Said to have built a timepiece that could calculate the rotation of Mars. Is that where we're headed? To his house, yes, though we might as well be going to his tomb. The Penfield house stood on the northern edge of Norbridge, surrounded by frost-bitten trees and a rusted iron fence. It was an odd structure, tall, narrow, more tower than home, and eerily quiet. Lyle led us through the front door, past a dusty parlour filled with unfinished blueprints and disassembled gears, then up a winding staircase to the 3rd floor. Brace yourselves, he muttered. The room was circular, with a domed ceiling painted in faded constellations. Every wall was lined with clocks. Grandfather, mantle, cuckoo, pocket watches under glass, metronomes in silver cages, even a colossal clock embedded in the floor, its hand frozen mid-sweep. And at the centre of it all sat Josiah Penfield, or rather, what remained of him. He was upright in a high-backed chair. His face was slack, eyes open but empty. A half-finished chronometer rested in his lap, and one skeletal hand gripped a pencil frozen mid-sketch. Holmes knelt at his side and placed 2 fingers at the man's throat. After a pause, he withdrew his hand. Dead, certainly, and long enough that rigour has come and gone. Lyle nodded. We reckon he passed just before midnight 2 nights ago, but here's the thing. We heard him, speaking, hours after. I stared. Who heard him? I did, and so did the maid. Clear as day, from outside the room, his voice muttering, something about rewinding the world. We tried the door. It was locked from the inside. Holmes examined the room in silence. He moved like a ghost among the clocks, occasionally pausing to listen. Every timepiece pointed to 4:17. Even Penfield's pocket watch. Even the great brass clock above the fireplace, its pendulum now frozen. Watson, ever the skeptic, gave a sniff. Surely there's a mechanical explanation, a power surge, some internal failure. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, but why all clocks of varied make, era and design halt at the same instant? He pointed to a small bird clock mounted above the window. This one has no mainspring. It runs on weighted descent. Impossible to synchronize with anything else unless... He stopped. Unless what? Holmes asked to inspect the house alone. Lyle and I waited below where tea had been laid out, though neither of us touched it. When Holmes returned an hour later, his face was pale. Watson, do you recall the theory of sympathetic resonance? I blinked. The phenomenon where vibrating systems influence each other, like tuning forks that cause others to hum. Holmes nodded. Imagine such a resonance applied not to sound, but to timekeeping. Lyle frowned. You're saying he found a way to link every clock to one master mechanism. Possibly, but that still doesn't explain the voice. Holmes paced. Unless... He looked toward the stairs. I need to examine Penfield's workshop, the true one. There's a false wall in the cellar, hidden behind a shelf of old railway clocks. I saw the hinges beneath the dust. Lyle blinked. But that room's been sealed for... Holmes cut him off. No room is sealed forever. Down in the cellar, behind a shelf that groaned open on silent hinges, we found it. The true laboratory. 10 feet underground, windowless, silent. At the centre stood a single machine. Not a clock, not quite. It resembled a gyroscope married to a cathedral bell. It pulsed faintly, though there was no power source, and behind it, etched into the wall, was a phrase scratched in iron. He who commands the tick need not fear the tock. Holmes stared at it a long time, and then he whispered, He didn't want to measure time, Watson. He wanted to stop it. The machine before us defied description. I say that not out of awe, but frustration. As a medical man, I am used to complexity, but Penfield's creation, if it could be called that, was not built for hands or eyes. It stood 6 feet tall, made of interwoven brass spirals, glass spheres, and what appeared to be the inner mechanisms of hundreds of clocks, restructured, twisted, welded into impossible alignments. At the top, a massive gyroscopic ring spun silently, though nothing appeared to power it. No gear turned, no lever clicked, and yet it hummed. Holmes crouched beside its base. It's still active. I knelt beside him. But what is it? Not a clock, he muttered. At least, not in any conventional sense. There's no minute hand, no hour, no measurement. He glanced at the wall behind it, where Penfield had scratched that strange inscription. He who commands the tick need not fear the tock. Holmes stood and faced Constable Lyle. Do you recall exactly what Penfield was saying when you heard his voice? The constable furrowed his brow. I think it was something like, "The cycle has begun. Then only the pendulum remains." It was faint, muffled. I was sure it was him. Holmes turned back to the device. He was recording, not speaking. I blinked. A phonograph? Number something older, something stranger. He reached into a small compartment and pulled out a strip of metal with fine etchings across it, like Morse code inscribed by a spider. "Not sound," Holmes said softly, "but event." We returned to the main room where Penfield's body sat slumped among his motionless creations. Holmes examined the man again, checking not only his pupils and pulse points, but brushing his fingers along the skin behind Penfield's ear. Then he stopped. "Well, Watson," he said, stepping back, "we may strike natural death from the ledger." I frowned. "You found something?" Holmes nodded. "Look closely. Here, at the base of the skull. See this indentation?" I leaned in. There was indeed a mark. Small, circular, as if something thin and sharp had pierced the skin. Injection? Possibly, but the surrounding tissue is undamaged. No swelling, no sign of struggle. Whatever entered here wasn't entirely chemical. I felt a chill run through me, Holmes continued. And his posture, it's too perfect. Look how he holds the pencil, as if caught mid-thought. This was not a man who collapsed. He was interrupted. Lyle swallowed. "Then we're talking about murder." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "or something worse." Later that evening, we dined in the local inn. Holmes barely touched his food. Instead, he requested all available books on Penfield, old interviews, journal entries, even letters in the town records. I assisted where I could, though his pace of deduction left me breathless. Penfield was obsessed with more than clocks, Holmes murmured, flipping through an annotated engineering manuscript. He studied biological rhythms, heartbeat, breath cycles, circadian timing. He tapped a line from a private letter, written in Penfield's looping script. "If clocks measure our days, and our days our lives, then to halt a clock is to halt the soul." Holmes looked up. He didn't just build this machine to measure time, he wanted to contain it. At midnight, Holmes returned alone to Penfield's laboratory. I followed, of course, my concern outweighing my patience. I found him kneeling beside the machine, this time with an ear pressed to the humming metal. "Listen," he whispered. I did. There was nothing at first, then something faint, a repetition, not sound, not voice, a rhythm, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. "Heartbeat," I said. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, but not ours." He stepped back. "This machine is echoing a pulse, and I believe it is Penfield's." I blinked. "You mean it's keeping him alive?" "Number, but it is remembering him, repeating his final moment over and over." He gestured around the room. "That's why the clock stopped. Not because time failed, but because he forced it to pause. Just once." I stepped back, suddenly uneasy. "Holmes, are you saying this machine can halt time?" "No," he said flatly. "Not time, but perception, the subjective passage, a single instant stretched like canvas replayed again and again." "But why?" He looked grim. "Because someone else wants to enter that moment." We returned to the inn after 2 in the morning. Holmes slept not at all. He spent the early hours resketching Penfield's device from memory, overlaying it with diagrams of the human brain, maps of constellations, and the mechanical structure of a railway signal. By dawn, he had a theory. Watson, do you recall the concept of chrono-echoes? I do not. A hypothetical phenomenon. If one could record a moment with absolute precision, one might recreate not only the visuals but the choices made within it. A living loop. He tapped the diagram. Penfield's machine did just that, but he wasn't alone in its design. I blinked. What do you mean? Holmes slid a folded letter across the table. It had arrived during the night. No signature, no return address. Only 4 words written in immaculate cursive. Your time is borrowed. Holmes stood and donned his coat. We're being watched, Watson. I rose too. By whom? His eyes darkened. I intend to find out. But first, we must visit the last man to work with Penfield, the only one who ever dared challenge his theories, a man who vanished 6 months ago without a trace. And who is that? Holmes stepped into the morning fog and said, without turning, Professor Alaric Venn, the man who believed time was a disease. Professor Alaric Venn had once been hailed as one of Oxford's brightest theoretical minds. A specialist in abstract mathematics and temporal theory, he had published precisely 1 paper before vanishing from academia entirely. A 20-page treatise titled Chronostasis, a pathogenic model for time. The paper was banned shortly after publication. Theories that describe time not as a constant but as a contagion, an effect generated by shared perception, were deemed heretical by his peers. Venn had claimed time could fracture, accumulate, or stall, like infection spreading through consciousness. The very act of measurement, he argued, created the illusion of continuity. He was laughed out of the university, then he disappeared, until Holmes found a trace. The first lead came from a bookseller near Lambeth. A man matching Venn's description came in regularly, she said. Tall, pale, eyes like a raven. Bought old train schedules, astrology charts, even discarded physicians' logs. Paid in gold coins from the 1850s. Odd, I remarked after we left. Indeed, Holmes replied. Venn is obsessed with unrecorded time, the intervals no one noticed. Our second clue arrived by accident. A letter, unsigned, appeared in Holmes's coat pocket during our ride back from Norbridge. No one had come close to him, and yet it read, The fracture widens. Venn watches. Do not rewind what was meant to be forgotten. The writing was identical to the first note. Someone was watching us closely. Our investigation led us to an abandoned observatory in Surrey. Holmes suspected Venn had converted it into a lab after his expulsion. We arrived under cover of night. The gates had long since rusted open, and the surrounding woods grew so thick they nearly obscured the main dome. Holmes and I forced the old wooden door open, and were met with silence. Inside, moonlight shone through a massive hole in the dome's ceiling, casting silver beams across shattered glass, collapsed star charts and strange devices strung together with copper coils and ink-stained cables. But at the centre of the rotunda stood something familiar. A second machine. It wasn't identical to Penfield's, but bore unmistakable similarities. The same gyroscopic core, the same lacquer power source, but this one pulsed faster, as if more urgent. Holmes stepped closer and withdrew his magnifier. There's no dust, he said. This machine is active, recently maintained. He found a journal near the base, its leather cover brittle but the pages fresh. The first page bore only a single phrase. "The tic is the illness." We studied the device for hours. Holmes determined it was a kind of temporal beacon, a transmitter that emitted pulses through unknown means. According to the diagrams, it could synchronize local perception with remote continuity anchors. In plain English, it broadcasts time to those nearby, Holmes explained, forces your perception to match its rhythm. To what end? Holmes looked grave. To erase discrepancies, to smooth over fractures. I didn't understand, not fully, but I trusted his expression. And then we heard it, a slow, careful step above us, then another. We were not alone. Holmes extinguished the lantern. The next sound came not from above, but behind. A man's voice, flat and calm. "You shouldn't be here." We turned, and there he stood. Alaric Venn. His appearance was almost inhuman in its symmetry. Sharp cheekbones, unblinking eyes, limbs too long for his coat. He stared at Holmes without recognition, or perhaps with perfect recognition. "You are the one who opened the chamber," he said. Holmes straightened. "You were watching us." "I was watching the moment. You merely intersected it." Holmes took a step forward. "What was Penfield attempting?" Ben tilted his head. "Penfield wanted to extract the second. I wanted to fracture it. We parted ways when he chose preservation." He walked slowly toward the machine. "He wanted to trap a moment. I wanted to destroy it." I shuddered. "Why?" "Because a moment, once captured, is never alone. It ripples, it spreads." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You speak of time as if it were a parasite." Then turned. "It is. A parasite of perception. We believe we remember the past because of cause and effect. But what if our memory is simply the echo of something that never ended properly?" He placed his hand on the spinning core. "This is a cauterizer. It burns the wound shut." Holmes stepped forward. "You sent the letters." Venn's hand froze. "I warned you not to rewind it. He broke the loop. He thought he could perfect it." "Perfect what?" Venn's voice dropped. "Consciousness." There was a silence. Then the machine behind him stuttered. The pulse broke for a moment. A new rhythm emerged. Holmes's eyes widened. "Something is overriding it." Then turned. "Number not something. Someone." The machine's pulse changed again, matching the one we'd heard in Penfield's lab. Then backed away. "He's trying to continue the moment. From death. From memory." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we must shut this down. Penfield's death wasn't the end. It was the template. If this pattern completes..." Then stepped between us. "You can't stop it. The echo is seeded. The pulse has travelled." Holmes grabbed the core. Sparks flew, metal screamed, the machine snapped, and everything went silent. We awoke outside, not in the observatory and not in Surrey, but back in Norbridge, before Penfield's house, and the clocks were ticking again. We stood before the Penfield house once again. The wind stirred gently through the trees. The same rusted gate groaned faintly on its hinges. From within, a pendulum sounded. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Slow, steady, indifferent. "Holmes," I said, my throat dry. "We left this place yesterday." Holmes stared at the door. "And yet, here we are. No train ride, no recollection, no passage of time as we know it." I checked my pocket watch. 4:17 p.m. I turned it over. I tapped the face. I held it to my ear. It ticked. So did Holmes's. So did the great brass clock above the Penfield fireplace when we re-entered the house. Every timepiece in the house was working again. Even Penfield's. Even Penfield. Let me be perfectly clear, he was gone. Not just missing from the chair, not moved, gone. The chair was empty. The drawing tools set neatly beside it. No corpse, no trace. Not even an impression in the cushion. And yet the blueprints on his desk, burned at the edges the last time we saw them, were whole once more. Holmes reached for one. His hand froze. "Watson," he said softly, "what's today's date?" "October 17th. Number, look." He handed me a newspaper from the corner table. The date, October 15th, 2 days earlier. A cold silence settled between us. Holmes paced the room slowly, circling the clocks, studying the walls. He looked like a man walking through a memory, not confused, but measuring it for cracks. "What's happening?" I asked finally. "I believe," Holmes said, "we've entered the echo." "The... what?" He looked to the ceiling. We shut Ven's machine down, and in doing so we broke a chain, but that chain didn't stop. It recoiled, and now we are caught in the snapback. I blinked. "Are you saying we've gone backward in time?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. We've returned to the same moment, yes, but we are different. We remember. We tested it. The same maid answered the door. The same townsfolk passed us in the street. Even Lyle, when we found him in the inn, greeted us with confusion. 'You said you were leaving yesterday.' He remembered us leaving, but not returning. Holmes asked a single question. 'Do you still hear Penfield's voice?' Lyle frowned. 'Number not, since the second night.' Holmes nodded, thanked him and left the table. 'We must visit the train station,' he said. 'Why?' 'Because it may no longer exist.' The Norbridge station was deserted, not in the usual sense, erased. The tracks were still there, but the station building itself was half faded, like a memory that had not been fully recalled. The platform sign was blurred, unreadable, and the telegraph wires dangled with no poles to support them. Holmes knelt beside the rail and touched the iron. 'Do you feel it?' he asked. I touched the rail, and I did feel something, faint, like vibration. Holmes stood. 'This is the pulse, the one Venn tried to contain. It's spreading, along memory, not matter. The train that brought us here no longer belongs to the sequence. We are now passengers in a ghost moment.' I stared. 'And what happens when the echo fades?' Holmes didn't answer. He simply turned back toward Penfield's house. Back inside the laboratory beneath the home, we found the device once again. It was now missing parts. Coils gone. Glass cracked. The etched phrase, "He who commands the tick," had been scoured from the wall, and in its place a new line had appeared. "He who halts the talk inherits the loop." Holmes whispered, "It's adapting." Adapting? Yes, this echo isn't a repetition. It's an iteration. Each cycle becomes something else. It remembers us. He circled the device, running his fingers across its cracked edges. And the version we encountered before? That was a later copy. We're now inside an earlier instance of the loop, before Penfield died, before the clocks froze. I felt my hands tremble. So can we stop his death? Holmes looked at me. Number, that death already happened, and will happen again. But we may learn what caused it before it was refined into a moment worth repeating. He reached into the machine's base and withdrew a roll of paper. diagrams, notes, blueprints for the machine. Signed, a V plus JP. Venn and Penfield had built it together. We barely had time to absorb this before something changed. A sound, not from the device, from upstairs. Footsteps slow, measured, and unmistakably familiar. Holmes and I drew back into the stairwell shadows as the sound descended, one step at a time, and then, there he was, Josiah Penfield, alive, his skin pale, his eyes heavy-lidded but aware. He moved as though waking from a great sleep, and he walked directly to the machine. Holmes did not speak. He simply watched. Penfield opened a compartment we had not noticed before, inserted a small brass key, and turned it. A shudder ran through the floor. The clocks above chimed all at once. The hour. 4:17. Holmes grabbed my arm. He's initiating the first pause. The room around us grew darker, not through light, but sensation. Sounds dulled. Movement slowed. Even my own thoughts felt thicker. Penfield reached for the central gear, and then, just before touching it, he looked directly at us. "Time doesn't trap us," he said, though his lips did not move. "It only reveals what we never wanted to remember." And then he froze. Not collapsed, not asleep. Frozen, perfectly, terrifyingly still. Every clock stopped. Once again, at 4:17. Time had stopped again. I do not mean metaphorically. I do not mean the clock ceased to tick. I mean rather that reality itself had frozen, not collapsed or vanished, but suspended, as though the world had drawn in a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Holmes and I could move, yes, but everything else was wrong. The dust in the air floated motionless, the flame in the lantern held perfectly still, and Penfield, arms raised, fingers stretched toward the core of his machine, was as still and silent as a statue carved from breath. "What is this?" I whispered. Holmes did not answer at first. He walked around Penfield slowly, studying him from every angle. Then with great care he placed a mirror under Penfield's nose. No fog, no movement, and yet not cold. "This is it, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "The perfected moment, the original second Penfield managed to arrest, the point at which he tried to rewrite the condition of time itself." I moved toward the machine, but Holmes grabbed my arm. "Don't touch it. We're inside the field now. This space isn't normal." He removed a coin from his coat and tossed it toward the machine. It hung in the air, mid-flight, perfectly suspended. We stepped back. Time had not stopped for us, but it had stopped listening. That was the difference. And then we heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. The same heartbeat-like rhythm Holmes had once identified in Penfield's machine. Only now, it wasn't mechanical. It was external. We turned toward the stairwell. At first there was only shadow, then footsteps, then a second Penfield. He descended slowly, his eyes blank, his hands stained with ink. Holmes pulled me back into the far corner. "This isn't possible," I whispered. Holmes's face remained stony. "Oh, it's not only possible, Watson. It's necessary. We are now inside an overlapping loop, a fragment of Penfield's past intersecting with its echo. Then this is before his death?" "No," Holmes said grimly. "It's beside it." The second Penfield approached the machine. The frozen Penfield, the one from the original moment, was still locked in place, unmoving. The second man regarded him with something like sadness. Then slowly he turned and once again looked directly at us. And this time he spoke aloud. "If you see me now, then the device has failed." Holmes stood slowly. Penfield did not react. He seemed to expect it. "I built this to preserve clarity, to hold one truth in place. But truth has a cost, and I am not the only one willing to pay it. Venn wanted to shatter time. I wanted to refine it. We were both wrong." Holmes took a step forward. "You activated the machine willingly." Penfield nodded. "To save a moment. A perfect moment. But there is no such thing. All memory corrupts. All clocks drift. Now, the echo consumes." Holmes looked around. "How do we stop it?" Penfield's expression shifted. "Can't stop a moment once it has been chosen, but you can choose another. One outside the rhythm." He turned to the wall and pressed a hand against the scoured inscription, where once had been written, "He who halts the talk." With his fingers, he traced something in the dust. A new phrase emerged. "He who remembers first escapes last." Holmes muttered, "A memory. Stronger than the pulse." Penfield turned toward me. "Doctor, you keep records. You write. That matters. Your memories are anchor points. If you remember a time that the loop has not yet corrupted, you may guide your friend back." My throat tightened. "But guide us where?" Penfield closed his eyes. "To the one moment that has not yet been rewritten. The moment after I die." The world around us began to blur. The frozen Penfield flickered as if struggling to maintain his place. The second Penfield, the one speaking, grew fainter. Holmes gripped my shoulder. "He's severing this instance." "I don't know what that means." "It means, remember something, Watson. Anything outside the loop. Something true." My mind reeled. The clocks. The inn. The letter. The train. The tea. Then I saw it. A bird. On our original train ride into Norbridge, a bird had flown beside the window. Pale grey with a black stripe on its wings. It had struck the glass. And fallen. A tiny death no one else had seen. But I had. I closed my eyes. And remembered. Crack. Reality shattered. Like glass breaking in reverse. We were standing, once again, in the Penfield house. The clocks ticked normally. Penfield's body was in the chair, exactly as it had been when we'd first arrived. And Holmes was already moving. "We're outside the loop," he said, breathless. "The fracture is closed behind us, but only for now." He turned to me. "You anchored us, Watson." I swallowed. "By memory?" He nodded. "We've proven the loop can be exited, but the greater threat remains." He held up Penfield's final blueprint. "The next sequence has already begun." Back in London 2 days later, Holmes spoke to no one. He refused food. He refused clients. And then, at precisely midnight on October 20th, he asked me to retrieve a certain trunk from the attic of 221B Baker Street. Inside were notes, old case files, and to my great surprise, a letter from Professor Moriarty, dated a year before his death. Its contents, only 3 words: "Find the fracture." It was a week before Holmes spoke of the case again. He spent those days in a trance-like state, smoking heavily, barely speaking, staring not at the case notes but out the window, watching the movement of light as if gauging the behaviour of the sun itself. Then one evening, as the rain began to patter against the window panes of 221B, Holmes looked up from his chair and said quite plainly, "There's an archive beneath St. Dunstan's clock tower." I nearly dropped my tea. "Where?" "Beneath the base of the eastern spire," he said. "Moriarty kept a subterranean vault, a chamber of patterns. It was where he charted phenomena that broke the known order. He called it the chronologium." I stared at him. "Why didn't you mention this before?" He looked me dead in the eye. "Because I never knew it existed. Until now." The vault beneath St. Dunstan's was more myth than memory. According to Holmes, only 3 men had ever entered it. Moriarty, a blind watchmaker named Griggs, and a man only referred to in the old files as the Auditor. All were believed dead, but the coordinates were clear. Beneath the eastern spire, beneath the stone gears of the ancient clock itself, was a sealed grate. Rusted. Locked. Holmes produced a set of keys from his pocket. "Moriarty's," he said simply, and with that we descended. The stairs beneath St. Dunstan's wound downward far longer than the height of the tower itself. We passed gears the size of wagons, pendulums suspended in air, and strange brass mirrors that reflected nothing at all. At last we reached a steel door. Etched across its face were Latin words, "Tempus sine ortu," time without origin. Holmes pushed it open. The chamber beyond was beyond comprehension. The chronologium was no simple archive. It was a cathedral of time, towers of ledgers, columns of crystal cylinders, some spinning in air, a ceiling covered with constellations, some of them no longer visible in the night sky, and along the walls dozens of clocks, each labelled with a name. Not places, people. One read Penfield J, another Venn A, a third Holmes S. And then I saw it, a 4th clock, Watson JH, and unlike the others, ours were still ticking. "Holmes," I whispered, "what is this place?" He was already moving between the towers, plucking books, scanning pages. "This," he said, "is where Moriarty recorded deviations. Moments that failed to behave according to sequence. His obsession wasn't control, it was consistency." I moved to the wall of names. All the clocks were different. Some had reversed hands. Some ticked with each heartbeat. Some ticked only when I wasn't looking at them. Holmes brought over a book, bound in grey leather, titled Penfield/Venn:417 Protocol. Inside were diagrams we'd never seen. Pages and pages of intersecting time loops, pulses, and what appeared to be waves of memory loss, recorded, not theorized. Each ended with a single phrase, "Anchor incomplete. Echo persists." "I don't understand," I said. "Why would Moriarty care about this?" Holmes closed the book. Because he believed time was the final variable. He could control people, economics, crime, but time was immune, unless it could be influenced through perception. He gestured around the chamber. "This entire vault is built on the idea that reality can be rewritten from the inside out. If you change the way enough minds remember a moment, you change the moment itself." I felt cold. "But we stopped Penfield's loop." Holmes shook his head. "We stepped out of it. We never shut it down." He turned to the wall. "And someone else is still in it." One of the names caught my eye. It was the only clock with no movement at all. Not stopped, not ticking. "Venn? A?" "Holmes." He nodded. "Yes. Venn's clock isn't broken. It's paused." He opened a cabinet beneath the clock and removed a spool of wire, tangled and blackened, and a note written in ink so faint it was nearly invisible. Holmes squinted. "If you found this, the anchor failed. There are more of us inside now. Penfield made the loop, but the auditor fed it. Stop the sequence before it becomes the standard." We sat in silence for several minutes. Above us, the tower's massive clock struck 2. The vibrations echoed through the vault. Holmes tapped his fingers against his own pocket watch in rhythm with the bell. 4 taps, then 3, then 1. I looked at him. "What now?" Holmes stood. "Now we find the final machine." "There's another?" He nodded. "It's not in Norbridge, and it's not in London." He turned to me. "It's in Vienna." Later that night, Holmes and I sat on the train platform at Paddington, waiting for the midnight departure to the continent. Holmes was writing furiously in his journal. Not notes, not deductions, but symbols, curved lines, pulses, numbers paired with letters. "What is that?" He didn't look up. "Ven's waveform. I'm converting it into intervals. If I'm correct, the loop isn't only a moment. It's a language, one meant to be spoken by the mind, not the mouth." I shuddered. "And who is supposed to hear it?" Holmes looked up at the stars and whispered, "Whoever lives inside the silence between seconds." Vienna in late October wore a veil of amber mist. The sun rarely showed its face, and when it did, it glanced sideways through layers of cloud and smoke. Carriages moved like shadows, and the city's many clocks chimed with dissonance, as if arguing. Holmes and I arrived just after midnight, stepping from the train into an atmosphere so hushed it felt like the entire city had paused its breath. "Where to?" I asked. Holmes didn't look at me. "The Prater. There's a man who lives beneath the old Ferris wheel. They call him Der Urloser, the man without a watch." I blinked. "Is he connected to the machines?" Holmes lit a cigarette. "He built the first one." We found the man in a workshop beneath the wheel. It was barely a room, just a corridor of gears, wood and heat. The air smelled of ozone and rust. On the far wall, rows of watches ticked without rhythm, some running backward, others stopping and starting like hiccups. And in the centre, a man of indeterminate age. His skin was translucent with time. His eyes were wide, white, and somehow empty. He did not speak at first. He listened. Only when Holmes reached into his coat and produced the waveform journal did the man move. He stepped forward, slowly, and took it. Then, with the faintest of nods, he spoke in a voice like frost on glass. "You've heard the silence. His name, he told us, was Klaus Herzig. Or rather, that was what he had once been called. Now he simply called himself the Clockless. He claimed to have worked on temporal sound models for the Austro-Hungarian Royal Academy nearly 30 years ago. Before he abandoned language for resonance, he built the first oscillator from light and iron, a prototype of what Penfield and Venn would later refine. But Herzig didn't want to trap time. He wanted to erase it entirely. "Time is a habit," he said. "A music played so often we forget the melody." Holmes asked, "Where is the final machine?" Herzig pointed to a hatch beneath the floor. "It's not final, it's first. It plays the origin chord." We descended a narrow stairwell into what seemed at first a boiler room, but was in fact something far older. The walls were stone, not brick, and the arches overhead bore inscriptions that predated the city itself. At the centre of the chamber sat a glass sphere the size of a man, mounted on an elaborate cradle of bone-white metal. Inside it, a single motionless gear. No power, no sound, just presence. Holmes stared at it as if recognizing something. "What is this?" I asked softly. Herzig said only, "It's the second before time." Holmes moved carefully around it. The other devices looped moments, but this is before even perception. This is the 0 point. He turned to Herzig. "Why does it matter now?" Herzig replied, "Because the loops are hungry, and once they run out of recorded time, they come here to feed." My heart quickened. "You're saying Penfield's echo will collapse into this moment?" Holmes looked grave. "And what happens when it does?" Herzig touched the glass sphere gently. "Then nothing will have ever happened again." Silence. Then footsteps. Someone was descending the stairs. Holmes motioned me behind the sphere. A figure emerged from the stairwell, cloaked in black, head bowed. Then another and another, all wearing identical coats, identical gloves, and all humming softly in unison. A familiar rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Holmes's eyes widened. The choir. The legends of the temporal choir had been dismissed as superstition even among Moriarty's inner circle. They were said to be the first minds ever trapped in a loop, men and women who had ceased aging, ceased needing, and now existed only to preserve continuity. The morning of October 23rd dawned grey and brittle. We returned to Norbridge under false names, arriving not by train which had vanished from known timetables, but by carriage. Holmes, unusually silent, stared at the passing trees with the intensity of a man watching history unspool in reverse. At last, the outline of the Penfield house appeared between the thinning fog and hedgerows. No birds, no voices. Only a distant ticking that shouldn't have been there. It was 3:21 p.m. "Do you know what to do?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Not entirely, but I know what not to do." He unrolled the strange silver map once more. It glowed faintly from the inside, alive with pulses moving toward the centre. "Everything converges here," he said. "Every echo, every iteration. The moment Penfield initiated the pause, that is the moment Venn wants to burn into permanence. And if we're in it again," he looked at me with grim clarity, "then we either rewrite the origin or become ghosts in a clock that never stops." Inside the Penfield house, everything was precisely as it had been. The drawing desk, the clocks, the chair in which Josiah Penfield had once died, and, at the centre of it all, the machine. But this time, it was different. The core of the device was now glowing, not with light, but with memory. Around it circled fragments, pieces of other moments we had seen, Penfield's face, the outline of Venn's blueprints, even a flicker of the observatory's dome. The device had become a collector of time. Holmes approached it carefully, and he withdrew from his coat a small vial of dark liquid. "What is that?" I asked. "Unanchored resonance," he said. "Venn used it to track deviation. I'm going to do the opposite. Hide us in the loop." He injected the fluid into a port at the machine's base. The device flickered, then began to spin faster. Suddenly, a chime. 4 p.m., the beginning of the final anchor window. Holmes turned to me. "When the moment locks in, Penfield will appear again, just like before." "And if we stop him?" "We can't stop the man, only the memory. That's what they're looping. He pointed to the machine's pulse. Don't look away. Not once. That's how the echo gets in. The room began to darken, not with nightfall, but with convergence. The sounds outside vanished. The air stilled. A low-frequency hum began to rise from the machine, like a tuning fork vibrating against the soul. And then he appeared, Josiah Penfield, as before, mid-movement, mid-thought, eyes open, hand extended toward the core, frozen yet alive. This was the anchor moment. 4:16 p.m. Holmes held up the map. The pulses on its surface began to blink wildly, overlapping, clustering. Then a new voice filled the room, one we knew too well. You remembered again, Holmes. Alaric Venn stepped into the chamber from nowhere, as if extruded from the air itself. Behind him, the choir assembled. But they did not move. They were here only to witness. This is the final loop, Venn said. We offer you continuity, perfected perception, an end to deviation. The world will remember only what is necessary. Holmes stared at him. Perception without deviation is not memory, it's obedience. Venn smiled. What else is time, if not obedience to cause? The hum rose higher. 4:17 p.m. The clock struck the hour, but Holmes was already moving. He dashed to the machine and pulled free the resonance vial he'd inserted earlier. Then he did something unthinkable. He drank it. What are you doing? I shouted. But Holmes was already trembling. The machine responded, its core sputtering, dimming, changing. Then took a step forward. Number, that resonance is unbound. Holmes turned to him, eyes glassy, voice low. If the loop requires obedience, then let memory rebel. Crack! The world split, not exploded but branched. Suddenly, we were everywhere at once. I saw the observatory, the chronologium, Vienna, the Ferris wheel. I saw Holmes as a boy holding his first watch. I saw Penfield holding Venn's hand in friendship. I saw myself dying on a battlefield. I saw the bird at the train window. And then I saw Holmes's face. He was standing still, arms raised, surrounded by infinite versions of the anchor moment. Watson, choose one. Only one. I reached out and touched the moment before Penfield died, the only version where he looked at us and hesitated, the moment where the machine's rhythm broke for just a second. The chamber snapped back into focus. We were in the Penfield lab. But Venn and the choir were gone. Penfield sat in the chair, alive, confused. The machine was off. No ticking, just silence. Holmes collapsed. I caught him before he fell. He was unconscious, but breathing. Penfield looked at me. What time is it? I checked my watch. The hands spun madly, then stopped. At 4:18 p.m. the anchor had held. Back in London, days later, Holmes finally awoke. I was at his bedside. The sky outside 221B was overcast. He looked at me weakly. Did it work? I smiled. You tell me. He looked at the clock on the wall. It ticked. Normally. Holmes closed his eyes and whispered, "Good." But on his nightstand I found a folded note. Written in Holmes's own hand, "The echo is gone, but something remains. I hear the tick, and sometimes it listens back." There are two kinds of silence. The first is the absence of sound. The second is the presence of something that refuses to speak. Since our return to London, Holmes had not once spoken of Norbridge, nor of Penfield, nor of the Loop. But I knew him too well. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his mind. It was on the third day of quiet that I heard the tapping. 4 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 1. I rose from my desk at 221B and found Holmes seated at the window, unmoving, a page of blank paper before him. On it, he had written the same sequence again and again. 4-3-1, 4-3-1, 4-3-1. Holmes? He did not respond. His eyes were distant. Then, without turning, he said, "It's still broadcasting." Later that evening I caught a glimpse of his private journal. It was unlike any of his usual notes. He had begun to document not crimes or clues, but deviations in time. A postman who delivered the same letter twice. A widow who remembered a husband who never lived. A child who asked why the clocks whispered now. "Holmes, you said we ended the loop," I said gently. "We did," he replied, but the language survived, like an accent without a speaker. He stood, crossed the room and pulled from the bookshelf a volume I had never seen before. It was bound in black vellum. On the spine, the auditor's notes. The first page read, "To those who hear the tick, you are already being read." Holmes explained that the auditor, Moriarty's nameless associate, was never a man in the conventional sense, but a designation, a role, the one who listened for patterns that did not belong. And now, with Moriarty gone, Penfield buried, and Venn dissolved into silence, Holmes had become the new recipient of the pattern. He was becoming the auditor. He began building devices again, not to trap time, but to eavesdrop on it. The first was a pendulum clock with no hands. The second, a gramophone that played only in moonlight. The third, a mirror that fogged only when no one was near. Each, he said, was tuned to different moments, and slowly they began to answer back. It started with simple phenomena. The pendulum swung against gravity, the gramophone hissed with voices in reverse. The mirror whispered numbers. Then, on a cold November morning, Holmes vanished. No note, no coat, no footprint, only his watch remained, open, ticking backward and displaying a new name. Watson, J.H. And beneath it, Deviation, Prime. I was alone. 221B felt hollow without him. I feared the worst, but deep inside I knew better. He wasn't gone. He had simply stepped sideways into the space between thoughts. 3 days passed, then I heard it again. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Only this time it wasn't from the room. It was inside my dream. I found myself standing in Norbridge again. But it wasn't Norbridge. The angles were wrong. The streets rearranged themselves when I looked away. The sky pulsed like a heartbeat, and ahead at the centre of it all stood a tower, black, shifting. Its bells chimed not with time but with memory. Inside, Holmes waited. He was older, worn but lucid. "Watson," he said softly, "you remembered." "What is this place?" He looked around. The Echo's refuge, a containment field constructed from residual deviation. "I'm building a library." He led me inside. It was vast. Endless halls of blank books waiting to be written. "This place is invisible to the choir," he said, "because it doesn't exist until it is remembered." He handed me a book. Its title, The Clockmaker's Paradox. "You're writing this, Watson. You always have been." The tower began to shake. A chime rang out. Holmes looked toward the stairwell. "They found us." He pulled me close. "You must wake up. Find the last name." "What name?" He pressed a card into my hand. It was blank, but beneath my thumb ink began to rise. Letters formed. A name I'd never heard before, but which filled me with cold certainty. Auditor number Equinocta. I awoke in my chair at 221B. The fire had gone out, but the card was still in my hand, the ink still fresh. And from the corner of the room came a sound, a faint mechanical voice, repeating, "Begin audit. Subject Holmes, Sherlock, sequence drift detected." I turned to the mirror on the wall. There was no reflection, only text. Scrolling across the surface. Deviation prime found, cross-reference, Penfield, then Watson. New anchor forming. Await instruction. The fracture was not closed, it was evolving. The city outside 221B was drenched in relentless rain, each drop a staccato beat against the window pane, echoing the persistent rhythm Holmes could no longer ignore. It had been weeks since his disappearance into the strange tower within the echo, a place where memory warped and reality fractured. I was alone, yet burdened by a growing sense that the very fabric of our world was thinning. Then one evening, a knock. 3 knocks. Pause. 4 knocks. I opened the door to find a man standing there, coat drawn tight, eyes glinting with unnatural sharpness. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Gray, Point. His presence was unsettling, like a shadow stretched thin across the daylight. Without preamble, he handed me a small, unmarked box. Inside was a pocket watch, but this was no ordinary timepiece. Its hands spun erratically, sometimes reversing, sometimes freezing mid-tick, and etched along its edge was a phrase, "Auditor's Gambit." Mr. Gray's eyes pierced mine. "Your friend Holmes is trapped," he said, "in a game where memory is both the key and the lock." That night, as the storm howled outside, I sat with the watch in my hand, feeling its strange pulse sync with my own heartbeat. The room seemed to warp, colours bled, shadows grew teeth, and then from the depths of the ticking watch a voice emerged. "Watson," it whispered, "do you remember the first time you saw the echo?" I did. It was Penfield's death, the moment time folded in on itself. "Holmes is caught in a recursive loop within the auditor's construct," the voice said. "To free him, you must play the gambit." I realized then that the auditor was not a single man, but a network, a collective consciousness born from the fractured moments themselves. And Mr. Gray was a fragment, a player. The rules were simple and cruel. 1. I must relive moments from the past 3 cases, the train, the clock tower, and Vienna, but each with a twist. 2. Each twist would either free Holmes or tighten the loop. 3. Memory was the weapon and the battlefield. The first replay was the train journey, but the bird was gone, the window unbroken, and Penfield's letter was missing. Without the bird's accident, the key anchor vanished. Suddenly the echo swallowed me whole. I found myself in darkness. The voice returned. "You failed the gambit, Watson." I awoke on the floor of 221B. Mr. Gray smiled thinly. "Try again." Over the following nights I played the gambit, each replay reshaped by my choices. Sometimes I succeeded in preserving an anchor. Other times I lost it. With each success, Holmes's voice reached me faintly, With each failure, the echo grew louder. Finally, on the 9th attempt, everything aligned. The train, the clock tower, the Ferris wheel and Norbridge all converged. I found Holmes, trapped but aware, in a room lined with clocks ticking in impossible rhythms. He looked at me, eyes full of hope and exhaustion. "Watson," he said, "you've learned the language." Together we crafted a new phrase, one not of loops but of endings, one not of silence but of release. We synchronized the watches, we spoke the phrase aloud, and as we did, the clock slowed. The echo began to dissolve. Mr. Gray appeared once more. "This is the end of the gambit," he said, "or the beginning of another game." Holmes looked at me steady. "The fracture is not just a crack in time, Watson. It is a mirror," he smiled, "and sometimes the reflection stares back." The morning was strangely silent. No city noise, no ticking clocks. Only the faint hum of the residual echo vibrating beneath the streets of London. Holmes sat by the window, his gaze distant yet resolute. "Watson," he began, voice barely above a whisper, "we have crossed every line time set before us." I nodded, the weight of our journey heavy in my chest. "Is it truly over?" He turned slowly. "Not quite. The fracture," he said, "is a mirror reflecting ourselves, not just time's anomaly, but our own perception of reality." He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a fractured clock, its face cracked like a spider's web. "Each crack is a choice we made, each reflection a possibility." "But why does it listen?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Because the fracture is alive." Suddenly the walls of 221B began to shimmer. The room stretched and bent. A kaleidoscope of memories flooded the air. The Penfield machine, the chronologium, the Ferris wheel, the choir's silent watch. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small mirror, polished and warm. He held it up. In the reflection, I saw not myself, but a series of versions, Watsons from infinite timelines, some smiling, some weary, some lost. Holmes spoke softly. Every decision we made created a new shard of reality. A voice echoed from the mirror. "Observer," Holmes's eyes glinted. "We are both observer and observed." The mirror cracked. From the shards a figure stepped forward. A man, familiar yet unknown. He wore the same coat Holmes did. His eyes held infinite knowledge. "I am the auditor," he said, "and you have finally come to meet yourself." Holmes stepped towards his double. "Why are you here?" The auditor smiled. "To remind you that time's fracture cannot be undone. It can only be understood." He gestured to the shattered mirror. "Each shard is a memory you cherish, a truth you hold. Destroy one, and you lose a part of yourself." Holmes nodded slowly. "So, the loop, the echo, the fracture, they are not prisons. They are teachers." The auditor reached out. "Choose." Holmes looked at me. "Watson, do we close the mirror, or do we keep the fracture open?" I took a deep breath. To close it means forgetting parts of ourselves. To keep it open means living with uncertainty. Holmes smiled. "Then we choose both." With that, he shattered the mirror. But instead of breaking, the shards burst into light, a symphony of moments and memories intertwined. The fracture was no longer a wound. It was a bridge. The humming ceased. The clocks resumed their steady ticking. Outside, London breathed again. Holmes looked at me, eyes bright. We are the sum of our reflections, and every choice we make shapes the story ahead. I sat back. Then, what comes next? He smiled. More mysteries, more fractures, and perhaps, more stories to tell. The clock on the mantel struck 5, and with it a new chapter began.